Okay, thanks. I think just in terms of timing, why don't we go to roughly 3:25 with committee comments and discussions, then we have public comment. Again, let me ask, remember the yes/no question? I think, so do you remember? Okay, so I think the answer here is that some things are still a work in progress as described by Andrew, and what is sort of the timetable for bringing these frameworks to a point where you say, yes, we're there?
I think we have a working model. Yes, we're there. The refinements are really within the community. So for example, when you actually see the phthalates poster, you'll see that it's not too terribly different from what NAS 2017 used, from what OHAT used. So we want to have discussions with OHAT about how do we do this. We also want to better link sort of, I guess, the novelty in terms of what we're bringing to the table of the sort of the traditional systematic review communities is in approaches for integrating across evidence streams. Right? So this is something where we can take our examples and we can talk with GRADE and we can say, some feedback on this. I think we have templates that are good for us to use in our assessments.
I would put the caveat in about the summarizing conclusions for non-cancer health effects. I think that's definitely a discussion that's ongoing, I would say that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we have tried within the agency, but the issue is that we have very differences of opinion among sort of the users, consumers of our assessments for the use of sort of specific descriptors or narratives. So it's inherently, it's...
That's a statutory concept.
Right.
Okay, let's see. Karen?
I think I heard that the synthesis plan would be done before the data extraction, but could you just talk a little bit about how much of the analysis and synthesis plan is or could be outlined in the protocol or even in the handbook?
Well, in terms of the handbook, it's an approach that's described, things to think about when you're looking at the evidence. The protocol is going to be having looked at, at least having some idea of what the evidence is. I thought you said something. Having some idea of what the evidence is. I think that we do put in through the protocol how we plan to evaluate the evidence, but once you've gotten into it and you've evaluated the studies, then you're going to, at that point, then you can start to look at the results in light of the study evaluations. You kind of start to look at and tease out differences and possibilities for sources of heterogeneity, and then target the data extraction to that. It's kind of a back and forth, but.
So I think you've done a good job of explaining, to the extent that it's possible to explain, how to incorporate different evidence streams. But it does seem to me that, particularly when you start to figure out how to incorporate mechanistic kind of information, you have to go off script a little bit, and a lot of this use of the mechanistic information is going to depend on the expertise and, to some extent, the intuition of the person doing it, which means that there's got to be some sort of oversight to ensure that from assessment to assessment there's consistency. Who does that? I mean, the other steps, you have like this well-described process where you have two reviewers independently working, and if there are inconsistencies, you figure out how to resolve them. But this one, I don't see how that's done.
Well, I mean, I think to some degree, the discipline-specific work groups that we've put together try to serve as, a group of people with similar expertise that can then all review an evaluation that someone has conducted. And there's a lot of back and forth reviews there. But we also do our best, and I think in the future we're going to continue to, try to do this better, of again, identifying people external to EPA that have expertise, maybe, in the particular area that is most, the area that's flagged by the mechanistic evaluations, and finding people that can give us that very specific expertise that we will never have 100% covered in-house.
So with I'm just trying to think about how do you institutionalize something like that? You have more experience as to how often you use those, but if you're using them fairly often, is there a way to, do that as a quick review step instead of having to go through the ponderous review exercise that takes up most of your flow chart?
Actually, they are out before the ponderous review, and we do try to, I think that is the goal, is to find people that can give us a quick review. It's excellent if we can identify people within EPA, and that's very fast. The turnover is very fast, and that's something that we're working on. In terms of right, identifying people that are that we can work with very quickly and provide useful feedback. But if that's not, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's iterative.
I just wanted to add, so one of the discipline groups we have is the Tox Path group, which sort of specifically helps give feedback on this. Through the assessment plan and the protocols, we're asking them to sort of routinely review all of them, along with a systematic review working group, because those are our discipline groups that are really looking across assessments to sort of look for opportunities for consistency.
And I guess I would also add, if there are mechanistic questions that seem to keep coming up, we've had in the past, workshops to discuss particular mechanistic questions, the relevance of mouse lung tumors, things like that, where we have, a mechanistic question that keeps coming up in the assessments that we may not have an answer on, but we want to get kind of more closer to a consensus in the scientific field. We can, have that type of mechanism as well.
Rick?
So I'm still trying to puzzle out when your team of domain experts get involved in this process. Is it after your two-person review, or are they driving that two-person review? Where do you have them in the driver's seat on this assessment?
At the latest, they would come in at the individual study review. So those are going to be individual study evaluations by experts on those outcomes.
Okay.
Although, like, often, even in terms of the forming the team in-house, the FTE team, I mean, certainly our experts, our managers will be involved at the PICO, the assessment plan stage, making at that very early stage.
I just got a little confused when there was a question about conflict resolution. Then you bring in the expert, and that kind of implied that the expert isn't really involved in that early evaluation phase. So, good. It's good to get that clarification.
So just to go back to the cancer, non-cancer, I just want to make sure I understand why you would not use the same descriptors for strength of evidence. So I'm thinking, for example, the Surgeon General's reports, exactly the same descriptors are used regardless of the health outcome for which an evaluation is being made. I understand you may have different regulatory thresholds, but that's distinct from the evaluation of the evidence.
I have found that just trying to sort of apply the cancer to the non-cancer was a real barrier because of the sort of different requirements from our partners. And so Andrew and Barbara have actually sort of spent the better part of the fall trying to have these very targeted engagements to think about, how can we express our conclusions in particular on non-cancer that helps give us a bit of a breakthrough. But right now, there's not EPA guidance on sort of descriptors for non-cancer.
I think what we're finding is they're okay with the pros, they're not okay with the label. Right? I mean, that's where the resistance was. Some, not all. It's a cultural evolution, and it's not been we've spent a lot of one-on-one time. Emma can also maybe explain, but we're going to get there one way or the other. But even Bruce will tell you there's a lot of resistance in the community for reasons that are a little unfathomable, really, for us.
Right, but the process for, and I would agree for the descriptor part, but for the process of this two-step example-based categories, which is a step farther than we are on non-cancer in 2014, right? So I think this is less of a controversial area where we have these example-based categories that define different levels or strengths in some way, but then how to summarize that, I think, is where it becomes a little more difficult because there are valid and robust reasons for pushback.
Before we go to Dave, just a couple of other quick comments on the mode of action and so on. I mean, I think the discussion of in the 21st Century Science report, there's chapter 7, which does not tell you what to do by any means. I think it just talks about the complexities for the scientific community of addressing these issues. But I think it would be useful in terms of your thinking here, and I suspect you've looked at Tina's nodding her head. I see a yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Dave?
Can you help me understand a little bit better the evidence integration step? So I think I understand roughly that you've got the human and animal evidence streams. It looks like they start at the same plane, unlike OHAT that has like animal can be higher and human can be lower. And then there's steps in which it can be upgraded or potentially downgraded. But then at the end, it's not clear to me, like if you have a strong human stream and a weak animal stream, how those then lead to some type of integrated value. It's not like that your chart that's on slide 82 is kind of a black hole right there as far as how that's actually done, or, you know, so how do you actually weight the two streams to come up with your final conclusion?
So that integration of the two streams is this table here. So this would have.
Sorry, slide 82, the really tiny one that luckily being blind I can actually read.
Right.
So at the very end on the far right where you have, you know, your overall conclusion, it's not clear to me how within the stream, say you've got judgments that lead to strong evidence, weaker evidence, et cetera, how eventually that's then translated into the far right column of strong or weak or intermediate type of evidence.
Right, that translation is based on this table, I guess I would say. So this is actually how we get from the within stream conclusions for the human and the animal evidence stream and how we get to that right-hand column. So this is kind of that third to the last column.
We don't have that table. We don't have that slide in our notes.
It's in the PowerPoint version, not the
so you'll
PDF
have to
version.
Make sure
yeah.
we have that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, this defines how, if you have high human and weak animal, where you end up, or if you have medium human, whatever you're going to, not that that's the label, but if you had the moderate. Or,
yeah, we don't have that.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
And Andrew, in terms of the use of that template table, I mean, to recognize that this has sort of got all the options on there. So the idea is when you actually see it applied, if you look at the phthalate posters, it's not going to be this cluttered, right? It's going to have sort of the drivers of how we got there. I don't know if that helps in terms of that final step of outlining the why, but I think it is hard to sort of visualize that in the context of a template versus actually applied to an example.
Karen?
Question about the Bradford Hill criteria that you use and whether you document, and if you do document, the operationalization of that assessment. So for example, for consistency on slide 79, when you say different studies or populations, I assume you mean if you find similar enough results across, but what do you consider similar enough, and do you document those kinds of decision points in completing this?
I can try, give a first answer. Yeah, that documentation should occur in the synthesis. So we talk about, we do try to focus on consistency a lot, and we would look at, really, we're trying to differentiate inconsistent results in similar studies that you just can't explain versus, differing or heterogeneous results that you can see if you can tease out some potential reason for that difference. Either it's because of, some intrinsic factors like species or exposure or the experience, like exposure levels that the studies were at, or bias and that type of thing. So that's all to be documented carefully and clearly in the synthesis.
Right, and I should say that analysis and the synthesis is what informs us, but this is not the analysis. This analysis is across the considerations. That the synthesis displays the analysis of each consideration. I guess maybe that's a little clearer, maybe?
Right, yeah, that's true. Because, and then in the integration, you're actually saying how much weight you gave to this evidence because it was very clearly consistent, or there were some inconsistencies that you can't, explain.
Okay, let's say Richard and then Il-Young, and then we'll probably head off to the next thing.
So I'm not sure I can articulate this as well as I'd like, but I'm trying to get clear about the difference between how we evaluate individual studies and how we do the integration. And what occurs to me is that on the individual studies level, the way you've developed criteria for evaluating individual studies, each of them have a long tradition, right? We know about confounding, right? We know about sample selection bias. We know about all the different things of measuring exposure that might ruin an epidemiological study. And we have good ways to connect those to, the reason the study might be biased and which direction, right? So and that's all sort of, I think, fairly secure. And what you're up against in using that, or what you can root what you're doing has a long tradition. In the integrating the evidence, well, let me back up and say, when we asked about intercoder reliability or this and that, you presented the fact that lots of different groups in lots of different contexts have come to the same conclusion, right? So what I'm looking for is, do you have any sort of similar confidence either in what undergirds the way you integrate the evidence, or whether or not if you did it in lots of different contexts with lots of different people, you sort of get to a similar conclusion? That's not, you see what I'm getting at? It's like, what's driving you to think this is a reliable process that can withstand human differences, the errors in kind of the way people think, et cetera?
Yeah, so I guess right now I would say that, we've developed this template, we're road testing it. If you remember sort of in that software application where you could sort of have the different raters and look across them, we can build that into the software. So what we would like to do is have that so operationally we can have people independently do it and evaluate it. Right now what we're doing is really trying to sort of keep engaged with the broader community. We do sort of a lot of work with GRADE. Holger Schneemann came here to visit and talk about our approaches. And so I think that a lot of the domains that are already in the GRADE framework, if you're familiar with it, I would say we're trying to operationalize those similarly. But there's areas like coherence, or thinking about the biological plausibility of mechanistic information, the sensitivity domain, and integrating across evidence seems it's just underdeveloped in the field. So I think that by trying to work with GRADE, because they work by developing examples and trying to come up with guidance about how do you consistently get people to think about the same things. I think that's where we want to move in parallel to thinking about software workflows where we can do this independent analysis.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up. So now it seems like the answer to John's question, the yes or no question, is no, this isn't final. There's iteration to be had in lots of different ways.
Yes,
that's what it feels like you're saying.
Yes, but also actually in GRADE, they're undergoing a shift. And in part, when they, in particular, thinking about how they think about the observational study. So moving, if you're familiar with the GRADE framework, moving away from having, RCTs be high and observational low, and having a robust tool like Robin's Eye help dictate where they fall. So actually, the GRADE framework is in a state of being a bit dynamic. And so we're looking for opportunities that we can try to harmonize or be philosophically similar as they evolve.
Yeah.
Promised to be a simple one before the break. So on page 76, I think Catherine mentioned organizational frameworks are useful. I'm just curious about to what extent the mode of action framework and AOP-like constructs being implemented, or it's still a work in progress.
Well, the mode of action framework is from the 2005 cancer guidelines, and I believe every assessment we've had since then, and probably before then, has implemented that framework based on the modified Hill considerations. Sometimes not in exactly the same way, but it's important to have flexibility in these frameworks to have this framework as a way to best convey the weight of evidence. So for the AOP-like constructs, we've been implementing those to some degree. I believe Xavier's used those. I don't know if it's in your poster so you can look at Xavier's poster where it shows just how we've used, of course AOPs are not chemical specific, they're chemical agnostic. And so we're not really suggesting that we are developing AOPs, but rather there are some really useful visual elements to them that can show linkages between different key events and how these might lead to an adverse outcome. Implement, and bring in other information we have on mechanism to those visual constructs. But it is problematic because anytime you try to summarize such complex information into a picture, you're inevitably going to be leaving out key details, and so it's definitely difficult. I don't know if that answers your question.
So one yes, one no, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I'm typically someone that says nothing is ever final, so I don't.
So yes/no.
Yeah.